third part here, what we're going to look at is in the second part. If you haven't watched that, go and watch that first. We were talking about negative feedback, right? And when you think of the term, or when you think of the process negative feedback, think of stabilization. Okay, think of trying to stabilize your given variable. So whether that be heart rate or blood sugar or blood pressure or body temperature, as the example we gave, think stabilization, right? We're trying to keep things roughly stable at some given or within some given range, right? So the second or this third video that we're going to look at, this is going to be positive feedback. Okay, positive feedback. And with positive feedback, the word I want you to think of is reinforce. Okay, think reinforce, right? So the sequence of events that's going to occur is occurring in an attempt to reinforce. Okay, so reinforce whatever the initial stimulus was, right? So we're moving further and further away from some given set value, right? Also, with positive feedback, this process is going to continue until you have some climactic event, some kind of major event has to occur for this positive feedback loop to, or this cycle of positive feedback in order for it to stop. There has to be some major event, right? We gave a few examples, I think it was in part one, of positive feedback. One of those was blood clotting, and another one was the childbirthing process or the labor process. And so that's the example that we're going to look at here, right? So for positive feedback, again, think we're moving in a direction, and we're going to continue moving in that direction until something big happens, right? So for our labor example, a few things. We have our fetus, right? So we have our fetus here, okay? Our fetus is inside the uterus, okay? So here's our uterus, this kind of pink structure here. And then here is our what's called the cervix. Okay, so we'll call this the cervix. The cervix is the opening between the uterine cavity where the fetus is and the vaginal canal that you see right here. Okay, so we have to go through a process, and in this labor process, you go through a process of trying to stimulate the uterus to contract in order to expel or to push the fetus out of the uterus through the birth canal, and then this results in birth, right? So the first thing that you have is you may have an initial uterine contraction. Okay, you have an initial uterine contraction, and the major hormone that we're going to talk about, and you'll talk about this when you do more endocrine-related discussions, is the hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin. And there's a synthetic form of this that you may see called Pitocin in a clinical setting, Pitocin. But oxytocin, this comes from it's made in the hypothalamus, it's stored in the posterior pituitary, and one of the things that it does is that it stimulates the uterus to contract, right? So the uterus is going to contract, right? So that's what we have first here is oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions, and it pushes the baby, it pushes the fetus towards the cervix, right? So it's pushing it down this way. And that part of the makeup of the uterus is it's very muscular. It has lots of smooth muscle that's going to be contracting, right? As a result, this fetal head, okay, all of this space, kind of all right here, is going to push on the cervix, right? And so remember, the cervix is this region right here, right? All of that is the cervix. So as the baby's head pushes against the cervix, it's going to stretch it, right? And the cervix is going to stretch. And as a result, there are mechanoreceptors. So again, remember we talked about a component of a feedback loop, you have to have a receptor, right? A sensor to pick up the stimulus. And so there are mechanoreceptors in this cervix that are going to be stretched as a result of the fetal head pushing on the cervix, right? So these nerve impulses, so again, this was number 2 here, the fetal head is going to push against the cervix. Number 3 is that those receptors are detecting and picking up that stretch and sending a signal to the brain, which in this case is going to be our control center, to initiate a signal. And what is the signal that's being stimulated is further oxytocin release, right? So we're secreting more and more oxytocin, right? Well, think about what we said earlier down here with number 1. And so this oxytocin, this is a hormone. Okay, this is a hormone. Hormones travel in the blood to some distant effector. So number 5 here, oxytocin is going to enter the bloodstream, travel to the uterus. And what did oxytocin do in step 1? Well, it stimulated the contraction of the uterus, pushing the fetal head against the cervix. Number 2, stretching the cervix. That stretch was picked up by mechanoreceptors in the cervix. So number 3, those impulses are sent back to the control center to stimulate further release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland where it is stored. So that's number 4. Oxytocin enters the bloodstream, makes its way to the uterus, and this process continues and continues, right? So you can see here how we continue in this cyclical fashion, right? We continue in this cyclical fashion until we have some major event, right? So in this case of labor, what is the major event? Think to yourself, what is the major event that has to occur in order for this process to stop? And hopefully you're thinking birth, right? Hopefully you're thinking birth. You have to get the baby out of the uterus, right? So you continue to have this contraction of the uterus, pushing the baby, pushing the fetus against the cervix until you have the cervix dilated, you have the cervix effaced, and that fetus, that baby, is able to ultimately make its way out of the uterine cavity, and you have a birth, right? But the big thing here is we continue moving in a given direction so long as you have the stimulus, which again is the pushing of the fetal head, right? So once you have birth, you no longer have the fetus in the uterus, so you no longer have stretching of the cervix, so you no longer have this feedback loop occurring, right? So the positive feedback loop has stopped, right? Now, in reality, you still have oxytocin release, so there's actually still contractions of the uterus even after birth. This can also occur, especially if the mother chooses to breastfeed, and one of the things that you need for the release of milk is oxytocin. Go figure. So the oxytocin that is causing the release of milk is also continuing to stimulate the uterus, and so it's not uncommon to have uterine contractions during breastfeeding. Right. Now, I'll make one important note about oxytocin, since we're on the topic of labor, is in a clinical setting, oxytocin. Do you think you give oxytocin? Do you give oxytocin fast, so as a medication, or do you give it slow? So do you give oxytocin fast, or do you give oxytocin slow? What do you think? If you were a nurse, if you are a labor and delivery nurse and you were caring for a patient who was giving birth and you were helping to induce labor, do you think you would push and slam a whole bunch of oxytocin very rapidly, or would you give it slow over time, right? Well, hopefully your answer is you give it slow, right? So you always give oxytocin very slow. You give it typically via a drip IV. You never give it IV push. You don't ever slam it into the patient for the reasons that we talked about here in this positive feedback loop, right? If you slam a bunch of oxytocin, you have a massive, right? You have a massive uterine contraction, right? Which is going to massively push the fetal head against the cervix, and you can actually end up harming the patient, potentially both the mother and the fetus, in the event that you give oxytocin rapidly, right? So you'd always give it slow, right? So we will stop there with this video, and I will see you in the next one.